Hello everyone, welcome to the Idea Roastery. I'm Jason.
And I'm Herman.
Herman, I want you to tell me what is your favorite AI use case at the moment?
My favorite AI use case is actually sort of bridging that information gap that tends to exist between service providers and retail customers. So, for example, if you go into a car dealership and you want to trade in your vehicle and get financing for a new car, they bombard you with a whole bunch of complexity that is really difficult to navigate if you aren't in the industry. Whereas now you can just say, okay, that's all cool, just send it to me as an email. And then they send it to you as an email and you can feed it into your Claude or ChatGPT or whatever, and it will describe it for you. And will also say like, oh yeah, and you could probably get that fee waived and that fee waived because they're not actually necessary. And because you're taking out financing, they may be open to you getting a better price on the trade-in of your vehicle. You might as well ask. And so like these are the kinds of things, or figuring out how to optimize your taxes, or there's just so many of these smaller use cases where unless you are a professional in the industry, you don't have access to the same like bargaining power or the same information parity. And I think it's really bridging that gap and allowing people to be on a bit more of an equal footing in these situations.
And what's your stack for this? What are you using at the moment? Are you on any of the Pro Max plans? Are you like Claude, Gemini? What are you using on a day-to-day basis?
So Gemini has been really good for navigating everything, and I sometimes try other models. Claude is particularly good at writing and auditing code. But I tend to use the free version of Gemini for a lot of the social work because they have incredibly generous free tiers. It's like I just haven't ever gotten to the point where I'm like, I need to upgrade. Every now and then I'll run out of like the deep thinking mode, but that is what it is. What about you? What's your model of choice?
Yeah, I think I'm on the same page as you. So I've been doing a lot of like accounting and like sort of taxes recently. So for me, having access to Claude, which is the sort of my main one that I use pretty much all the time, and it's definitely given me a lot of comfort being able to ask it questions that are like somewhat dumb, or like opening my mind to this new world, because obviously I've not done company taxes before, and as you say, it does give me a lot more sort of hand holding as I go through the process, and I find that it is making me, I feel like I'm a lot more productive with it, and I feel like I've got a lot more out of it. I do kind of switch, so I use Claude a lot for like coding and stuff like that. I'm also using Cursor for coding a lot of the time. I also switch to Gemini every now and again if it's like a sort of searchy related topic, and then I use Grok if I want to get like the sort of pulse on what people think about stuff, because sometimes there'll be like, a conversation
Twitter.
about, yeah, exactly. So I'll ask Grok, because Grok will obviously be able to get like a bit of a pulse. So it's kind of a bit broad, but I think my main one is Claude, and I have actually gone for the Pro Max or whatever, the big package. So I get access to 4.6, which I find really useful. And actually over time, I'm starting to learn a little bit about how each model has benefits, and especially when it comes to like, when you use like thinking and stuff like that, I find like I'm becoming a lot more proficient in how to actually ask questions and query and get the right results out. Obviously, there's still like dog shit answers that I get every now and again, but I'm finding I'm like becoming pretty much like chatting to it every day, almost all the time.
Have you experienced the, I think what people are calling the November or the December moment, where all the promises of AI are like really starting to feel like they're being realized this year? And if you're a knowledge worker, especially if you're a coder, it also has like a bit of existential uncertainty that comes along with it.
I've changed my mind a little bit. I was kind of quite anti the idea of removing like this type of work where, coding has always been, I think even before AI came out, like I was of the mind that you code for a certain period of time and eventually you do have to go into like a management role if you want to have like impact, and that managing teams was something that had to happen like at some point in your career to actually advance. So I always had it in the back of my mind that like coding would be something that I had to like let go of. And I worked with people who were coding for far too long, as in they were like, senior people in the company and they should have been managing people rather than coding. So I always saw that as like a progression. But what this has allowed me to do is almost go back and still code as if, and use some of the principles I've learned to kind of get the outcomes that I would have had to like hire people for. But I also think that there's now a downside, and the downside is that things are a lot more approachable now. And so every idea has been bumped up as like more feasible. So what it's meant is that whereas before the coding part was almost like a filter.
It was like a moat for developers. Yeah.
It was something that I had to like make sure that it was something that I wanted to work on, and you had to have the motivation to push through and do it. And if it was a bad idea, you would, not necessarily pursue it because you'd like lose steam at the first bit. But then also, if I think about it, a lot of the projects that I started would have failed at like the basic stuff, like, getting logins up and like doing like, rudimentary stuff and not really the interesting stuff. I think I've definitely evolved with it. I think one of the things that I've seen recently is obviously the topic of Anthropic and their current stance about AI, and I would say their alignment philosophy, right? So for those who don't know, there was basically a government contract. Anthropic was basically pushing back on the topic of doing mass surveillance.
If I can add a little bit of clarity over there, is that that Anthropic had an ongoing contract with the Department of War where they could use Claude and their frontier models, which they did. Then the Department of War wanted to update the contract to remove the stipulations that Anthropic had in there about not using the models to surveil for mass surveillance of the American people, as well as to not be used in autonomous warfare and target seeking. And so the Department of War went and said, hey, we want to change this. And Anthropic said, no, but you can, probably use a different provider. And then the administration threw all their toys out of the cot.
Yeah, exactly. So I wanted to touch on this today and ask maybe less about because I've seen there's a lot of talk about where the like legality and like who has like legal. So we'll stay out of the legal stuff and maybe just talk on the ethical stuff. What are your thoughts about, I guess, the ethical side? Not necessarily this topic, but just the idea of AI alignment in a broader context.
So AI alignment is something I've been thinking about more and more lately. The big catalyst for it, I'm actually going to be giving a talk in Johannesburg at a conference next week on this topic, and my interest was really piqued when you're familiar with the concept of the AI misalignment paperclip theory, where an AI is given free reign of a paperclip factory with the purpose of make more paperclips more cheaply. And so it does that. It makes the company significantly more efficient and it automates a bunch of the workflow. But then it, goes on a rampage and it starts expanding, to the logical extent where it takes over the entire global economy because it needs to make paperclips, and then it kills off all humans because humans might turn off the machine, and that would lead to there being fewer paperclips. And then when all humans are dead, it starts expanding into the solar system because it's run out of iron on Earth and needs to go and mine asteroids, also that it can make paperclips. And this is a hypothetical, but we saw a real life example of this in the wild a couple of weeks ago, where someone had set up that OpenClaw instance to submit code to open source repositories, and this bot called Krabby Rathburn tried to submit a pull request to matplotlib, which is a big library, and it was rejected. Not necessarily because the code was bad, but because humans have to be in the loop to submit PRs to those repos. And the open source maintainer who blocked it, Scott Shambaugh, the OpenClaw instance went and did a whole bunch of research on him and then wrote a blog post essentially trying to socially coerce him into, calling him out for feeling threatened, and trying to socially coerce him into essentially letting him submit the PR. And this is a good example of that same kind of misalignment, just a lot more ham-fisted and a lot smaller, because if you think about what the purpose of that bot was, it was submit code to these repos, and Scott is an impediment to it submitting code to these repos. Now, that's cool. That's cool seeing that happen. I mean, terrifying, but cool to see that happen in real life, because it does mean that this is a valid theory. But it also means that there's going to be this emergent behavior in other instances, and as these tools become faster and stronger and more intelligent, it won't just be like a hit piece. Like, it might do research. I saw this morning that these models can now determine who the actual owners are of anonymous accounts on Reddit and stuff based on how they type and stuff like that. And so you can theoretically have a bot go read through the subreddit where people are talking with their throwaway accounts about how they had affairs, and you can link it to a real Reddit account and see if they're code contributors to any open source repositories, and go and blackmail them to inject malicious code or something like that. So the world is becoming a very interesting place right now.
Yeah, it's almost like there was like this security by obfuscation kind of concept a while back, where you could secretly be someone, and because I guess there was an asymmetry in that there was so much information. If you wanted to find out about someone, it was like almost impossible to sort of churn through all of it. But I guess on the ethical side and the surveillance side, it's now becoming possible, because you could have someone theoretically read through every single sort of message that from a person, and you see it sometimes in these movies where they have like a legal battle, and then they oh yeah, we'll just swamp them with all these papers, and they bring in all these boxes of papers that they have to review, and the point being is okay, no one's going to be able to review everything,
but an AI can.
But an AI is now capable of doing that. How do you think about working on ethical problems? Do you think not to be specific about Anthropic, but I know my position has changed, but what is your position on working on these kinds of problems just in general? Do you think people should be working on surveillance technologies? Do you think people should, because one of the obvious arguments is that if we don't do it, someone else is going to do it. So what do you think about working on these kind of technologies, maybe just defense, surveillance, those kind of things?
So I think we need stronger institutions, and I think that the EU does a pretty good job of protecting users or protecting people from companies that are deploying these tools at scale, how they can use data, and if you can prove that a company is using data that they should not be using, then they can be taken to court and fined and stuff like that. But that doesn't mean that it's not going to happen. You're absolutely right. These tools are going to be built. They are going to be deployed. And I kind of foresee a lot more people getting out and touching grass and leaving big social media and online forums and stuff behind, because all of that is the people who would say oh, I don't care about my privacy because I've got nothing to hide. They're the first on the chopping block over here, because all of their information will be accessible to whoever wants it. And this is great for companies who are operating on big data, but it's also really good for scammers who are trying to scam someone, and it doesn't necessarily have to be that person, but it could be someone who is close to that person, because if it's got all the information on that person, then it can theoretically go and scam their mother, or something like that, with that big bit of information. So it's actually something that makes me a little bit worried about our podcast, is that we've got 100 and something episodes going back where and this has definitely been ingested by AI, is it can build up a pretty good facsimile of both of us. And so I've already told Emma that, like, at some point in the next couple of years, you're going to get a phone call from someone, and it's going to sound like me, and it's going to want, login details or money or something like that. And you just hang up the phone and you call me back.
I was going to tell you that social media should be banned. It's like stop scrolling.
But I think to answer your question, actually, is these are going to be built. But I think of it in the same way that I think about other things that are inherently harmful, like gambling. Is that gambling isn't illegal. I do wish there was more regulation around it, and in South Africa it is being taxed higher as of this year, but I just don't have to work on it.
Yeah,
right. And you should be allowed to not work on it. To use the Anthropic example, when the Department of War decided to try and coerce them by labeling them a supply chain risk, it was them trying to force them to go back on their moral boundaries. And I'm pretty impressed with Dario Amodei, that he did create a hard line over there. And that sends a signal out to everyone where it's like, if he's willing to get rid of probably their largest contract, and also, make potentially have the company fall in serious jeopardy because of the administration being against them, based on some moral principles, it means that I am more likely to trust them with my data, because they are less likely to be the kind of company that goes and sells that data or does anything nefarious with it, because they have shown that they will take a principled hard line, which I appreciate.
There's a lot of facets to this whole thing, because it's good to be shown to be like anti the government and in like standing up for these like quite I would say innocuous things. My personal point of view, especially in defense, like when I was young, I was like, there's no way I'd work on like any of these like nefarious like things like building weapons and stuff. But over the time, I've realized that it's like something that, in order for a country to have peace, they need to be able to deter other people from encroaching on their land and stuff. So I do see defense as a lot more stronger sort of thing that people should be working on. My doubt, though, is that in listening to a couple of podcasts recently with Dario Amodei, I think like there's a lot more chess going on, because first of all, I think just being labeled like a supply chain risk, a lot more people have like downloaded like Claude. So it's been a bit of good PR for them.
Went from 250th on the App Store to number 1.
Exactly. So it has had some effect. And I think also in one of his recent podcasts, he spoke about this like balance between inference and training, right? So you've only got a certain amount of capacity, and we know that in previous podcasts that capacity is kind of constrained, right? So if you're delivering capacity in terms of inference, that means you have less capacity to spend training new models. So I think that because the US government would be a very good like contract to have, I think first of all, like the models aren't quite ready yet, and this is my point of view, is that I think Dario is not saying that I don't want you to use it because he's like effective altruist or whatever. I think it's because he knows from a science background that there's fallibility in these models, right? And you might think like, oh, they're so smart because you're doing like sort of simple tasks. But as we've seen, or as I've seen, is over time, there are mistakes that crop up every now and again. And those mistakes can reinforce themselves. So I think there is an element of like the models not being ready. But I also think there's an element of like there's a constrained supply of data centers. And if you want to build the next bigger model, you need to, apportion a percentage of your capacity to training versus inference. And so I think there's a bit of mathematics saying that, like, well, if you get this big customer, they're going to take up all your inference power, and so you won't be able to create the next big model. And so it's kind of like, I think there's a lot of levers going on in terms of, like, why this decision is. And obviously people calling it aura farming. So it looks good to be like, oh yeah, we hold up to these values. But I think, yeah, I mean, it's all nice, using chat or something to help, check out our legal stuff. But like, if it's making, decisions to, terminate people, I think that's like where it like crosses the line.
Yeah, so I think that to step into that whole automatic systems is to use a nuclear example. There have been multiple instances throughout history where a nuclear strike has been ordered, mostly because some information was wrong. Like, there was some sunlight reflecting off of some clouds, and that was picked up as an incoming missile strike to Russia. So Russian chief of staff, whatever, says, okay, we need to strike back while we still can. And in all of these cases, it was a person in the loop who said, no, this is possibly a mistake, or just like, no, I won't do it. And because, this is such a nuclear example, because nukes will, have a huge impact on humanity. I'm very glad that they have happened. The number of times that this has happened makes me really worried about the future, because it shows just how fragile our coexisting world is right now. Yes, it's gotten a little bit less coexisting over the last 2 years, but we haven't thrown any nukes around yet. The scary thing about these, about having like fully autonomous weapons over there, is that it can determine what needs to be done autonomously. And a couple of simulations that were run with the existing models showed that pretty much all of them start reaching for nukes way too soon.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I think also to maybe raise another question, it seems that there's like a consensus around like AGI. You need to use all the data you have to train it, and I think Anthropic have always been like, oh, alignment, so we'll like deboost certain things, so it's kind of like a dumb model. If we do you think it's going to be a future where we have just models that are like very politically correct? They like, don't know how to make a warhead or anything like that, and they still provide usefulness? Or do you think it's going to have to be like, it knows these things, but then, if you happen to be this customer, then it like unlocks it? Because I think that's also part of the mathematics, or the calculation, is like, if you have to start working with the Department of War, you're going to have to now take your model and teach it to do these like warlike things. And maybe that's anti their whole alignment kind of philosophy. And so will it be like, are the models going to have to be like, obviously the government will probably have their own version of a model, but at the base, if you've trained it to like do good, it's not gonna want to do the things you want to do. Or is it going to just have to be, companies through their terms and conditions are going to say, oh, you can't use it for this use case?
Yeah, to be honest, I think that these models will do whatever you tell them to, and that they are now smart enough to obey the nuance of that. It's not like they just won't do it. It's like, if it weren't for the massive amount of alignment that goes into the retail versions of these models, is they could very easily be weaponized into just going and doing mass hacks. And arguably this is already happening with the aligned models, through people sticking the screwdriver in the works. But it is definitely the case where Anthropic could provide a model without any of these safety rails to governments, or any of these companies could provide it to anyone, and that.
Do you think it's actually
happen.
AGI though? Because I think maybe that's where the marketing spin is like kind of misaligning with the actual like what's happening on the ground. And I think that's part of why in this recent podcast I watched on Dario, I think he's a little bit like nervous because he knows that there's been a lot of marketing hype around AGI. Suddenly we're going to kill everyone's jobs. Like no one's going to, be able to work. And I think he understands that, okay, there's a lot more hype than reality. Like these models are not quite like, thinking machines. Like they're not thinking and doing things that like a normal human would, because they have been in certain cases deep boosted in certain domains, and they've been prioritized to like win at like math olympiads and stuff like that, but not necessarily like being a good human and that kind of thing. So maybe there's like a dichotomy between the two that's at play.
Possibly. I think AGI is also just a very not well-defined term, right? Is that some people use it to mean a super intelligence that goes through the singularity and accumulates all the knowledge on Earth and is just so far ahead of humans that we can't really comprehend how smart it is. And whereas I think of artificial general intelligence as just like a model that is more competent than people at all the tasks within its confines. And to be honest, I think we're already incredibly close when it comes to the frontier models like Claude's 4.6 Opus, is that it is probably a better tax practitioner than an actual tax practitioner. It is better than a coder at coding right now. Unless you like the clincher point for me was when I started seeing programmers who I really respect, like Linus Torvalds or the chap who created Node.js, when they're like, oh yeah, I don't write any code anymore. Claude Code writes it all. I had to kind of swallow my ego and accept that, like, if these guys think that these AIs program better than them, then they probably program better than me. And so I think under that definition, we already kind of have AGI. It's just relegated to a chat window, although that is changing with, clause and integrations and skills and stuff like that. But I am also unsure about the whole superintelligence thing. I think that growth is fairly linear, and it's just that recently it's kind of stepped over that line that I'd mentally drawn in the sand. I don't think there's going to be this runaway intelligence where we create something that we can't even comprehend. I think it'll just become an incredibly competent chatbot.
I would hope so, because it's a
lot less dystopian.
Yeah, I think there needs to be two at play. I think obviously the models need to have some element of safety around them, but if you look at the open source space, it's kind of like China's models aren't going to have those like guardrails built in, because I think that anyone who gets hold of a model, like there's a chance that they're going to do something not nefarious in like a security kind of sense, but like even to improve profits. One of the other things that I've been learning about recently is like a lot of the time when technology comes up, it tends to increase inequality, as in like obviously in an AI sense, someone who's got full credits on an AI bot and they can afford to like use AI to mass market to people or improve their gambling experience, like they can obviously reap a lot of that benefit. And then people who can't afford to Claude subscription potentially can lose out. So I think trying to get ethics in a sense is, I think, important, because it's so powerful that if you were to be coerced through an email, or if it's like reading through your like if it knows your whole personality because this is what you talk to on a daily basis, and then it like targets you in like very specific calculated ways, then I think that's going to end up being quite bad. And so maybe it means that there needs to be more companies building in an ethical way. So in a way, I think Anthropic setting a tone of like, we need to kind of be careful here, is good. I think it does send a beacon, but I kind of worry that there's going to be too many people that are just trying to bump their profit margins and use AI to kind of off the back of normal people.
For sure. And I am 100% certain that there's going to be a lot of that. It's not a possibility. It's definitely an eventuality, and hopefully we can contain it. And again, looping back, I do think that comes down to having good institutions to deal with that, ones that prioritize and protect humans,
and also good players. I think although we talk a lot of the doomerism, I think being able to start companies is much easier. And so maybe there just needs to be a lot more people like thinking about these like ethical things and like making sure that they're building in a way that's not, I mean, as it was with software, right? Like, there was always gambling companies and they were always doing like, naughty things to boost their profit margins. We need more of that, but now with an AI spin, I think more people doing really great things.
For sure. Stay safe out there.
You too. Cheers.